High Class, Social Problems, Chapter 5, Gender Roles and Discrimination. In this chapter, we address the issues of sex and gender in society. And it's important to distinguish these two concepts because one has to do with biology, and sex is more biologically based. It is determined at birth. There are chromosomal factors that come into play when it comes to our sex. For males, it is an XY. The Y's come from the daddy and the X's come from mom. So in order to produce a male child, you need an X chromosome from mom and a Y chromosome from dad. But in females, it is XX. So dads have both X's and Y's. Dad contributes an X. Mom contributes another X, and you have a female. There are also anomalies in nature that we see as well. There are some females who have only one X chromosome. There are other anomalies where there are males that have an extra chromosome, and these result in certain chromosomal abnormalities in nature. But for males and females, it's XX for female and XY for males. Gender, on the other hand, is a social construct. It has to do with the meanings that we attach to femininity and masculinity in society. They are very fluid. They are socially constructed, but they still have consequences for people and society. And they are tied to our sex and gender roles. Femininity tends to be assumed to be more passive, more submissive. Oh man, it's painful just to even say these words in the presence of a female. Then you have things like masculinity that tends to be more aggressive and tends to be more assertive in society. But understand, these are social constructs. These are not written in stone. These are not definitive. These are things that are attached to femininity and masculinity in society. That's when it comes to gender, where sex is more biologically determined, gender is a social construct. And when we look at stereotypes, gender stereotypes, we learn more about society's perceptions and labels they attach to masculinity and femininity than we know about masculinity and femininity itself, if that makes sense. There are roots, ancient historical roots to the idea of gender in society. Historically, in ancient societies, we had mother goddesses. The oldest known religions had mother goddesses. There was a worship of femininity, a worship of fertility, and many of the fertility gods, even the religion of that worship Astarte, that is where Easter comes from, was a Greek goddess, a goddess of fertility. You know, in the myth, the egg fell from the sky. It was multicolored. The doves landed upon it, and it hatched, and out came Astarte, the goddess of fertility. In modern industrial society, we tend to have more of masculine gods. That God is attributed masculinity, and that is a modern result of some of our myths and legends and beliefs about the supernatural. And they influence our values and beliefs also about gender roles in society. In our part of the world, in the Western world, we are highly influenced by Judeo-Christian values, the values that are espoused in the Bible. There are many, theologians, and there are other philosophers, and there are also social activists that question the basis for what we call gender roles in society when it comes to males and females in these Judeo-Christian values, but they're highly influential. That women are in a subordinate role to men, and men are in a dominant role in relation to women in society. There exists an inequality between men and women based upon their roles in and outside the home, where men have historically been the breadwinners and women have worked in the domestic capacity. During World War II, there was a dramatic shift in the number of women who entered the workplace. Johnny went off to war, and all of the factories and companies experienced labor shortages. So women entered the workplace in large numbers. That's where you see the old ads, Rosie the Riveter, where women entered the workplace. And after the war ended, that women did not go back home and became, traditional moms and traditional wives. Many of the women stayed in the labor market and to this day occupy a very significant place in our labor force. Gender stratification is a process where we position men and women in society. The stratification system, again, like racial stratification or even like class stratification, is a hierarchy where we see, with respect to gender, men positioned at the top and women positioned at a lower level than men in society. This hierarchy can be based upon many factors. When it comes to gender, however, it's based upon ascription alone, those things that are attributed to us at birth. It can be very subjective and arbitrary that men occupy this sort of higher role in society than women. And despite a woman's merit, women have very little mobility and the possibility for promotion, and even when it comes to hiring women, is highly limited based upon something that is attributed to them at birth that sort of limits their mobility and opportunities in society. We have a problem of gender conflict in society between men and women. We have competing roles in society, the role of being a father and being a husband, as opposed to being the role of being a mother and being a wife in society. But this conflict can be assumed to be an inherent part of society. That is just the way society works. And throughout history, we have seen this conflict between men and women in society. This conflict has a basis in economics, where we tend to pay men significantly higher than women, or more than women in society. On the average, women make 50 to 70% less than men in society. So a man makes $100, a woman makes $50 to $70 in comparison to their male counterparts. When we bring in the factor of race, we will see that women of color tend to make about half that of white males in society. So there is an economic basis to the gender conflict that we have and inequality in our society. Women are also penalized for being wives and being mothers. There's what's known as the mommy track. This is where women in the labor force are limited in terms of their opportunities and their mobility based upon their marital status and whether or not they have children. This is a very unfair process in terms of how we see women positioned in society based upon their marital status and whether they're and motherhood. We also see that there are other women who may delay marriage, having children, or may completely forego having children or being married at all. They tend to have more mobility, but they are still limited in comparison to men. So again, it is the ascribed status of women as female that limits their mobility more than any other factor, despite their hard work, despite their qualifications, despite their experience and education. In the larger society, we operate based upon not only things that are definitive in terms of the various gender roles and the sex-typed roles that we have in society. And by sex-typed, we mean that there are roles that men generally occupy. Men are typically the CEOs of corporations. Women are typically vice president or some lower level in terms of management. We tend to see male doctors. Females are typed to be the nurses. We tend to see in the educational system, we see male administrators, principals, superintendents of schools, and we see women as teachers. So we have all of these sex-typed jobs in society that are attributed to women that have very little to do with their qualifications, but more with these perceptions that we have of males and females in society. We have gender stereotypes, stereotypes that women are things like women are emotional. And we argue that women are emotional, men are not. Well, both are emotional because both are the same species. Both are human. It's just that we tend to see women cry, so we say that's emotional. But we see males who are angry, we don't call that emotional, but it's an emotion. And we are all emotional creatures. And so based upon these perceptions and often stereotypical ideas about men and women, they have consequences for women in society. How we perceive them and how they are positioned in our stratification system. We would live in a society where men are not just dominant. Now we know statistically it is about 50-50. There is not the significantly greater number of men versus women in society. That does not explain why men tend to dominate the best jobs and hold the higher positions in society. That really does not explain it. There's a woman by the name of Rosabeth Cantor who wrote a book called Men and Women of the Corporation. She explains this inequality based upon the tendency of men to reproduce themselves in organization. Being homosocial reproduction. That men like to surround themselves with people who have like interests and like temperaments, and therefore women do not tend to fit that kind of scenario. So women are often excluded from participating at certain levels in a corporation or an organization. And men tend to hire other men, particularly in these positions of power, privilege, and autonomy at the higher levels of a corporation. Men tend to have more occupational prestige than women. And women tend to have more subordinate and lower paying jobs with very little autonomy and flexibility. So we also have these two tracks. As I mentioned, we have the mommy track and the career track, but there's also this phenomenon known as the second shift, where women, once women who are in the labor market, the labor force, when they leave work, they go back to work. They go home and perform the domestic responsibilities, a second shift, where we have men, on the other hand, they go to work, they come home, and they're off. They're off, and they tend to do very little as opposed when it comes to the domestic responsibilities, caring for the children, cleaning the house, cooking, all of the things that revolve around the home. Women in our society play a vital role. We know in terms of the procreation of our species, of human beings, women are very vital. The health of a society is primarily determined on a global scale by the health of women, because if we do not have a viable fertility rate, then our society is not sustainable. There are some populations around the world, countries like Germany, Sweden, Holland, Denmark, some of those countries have what's known as a zero population growth. It means that they do not have a sufficient fertility rate to replace their populations. And so they are encouraging young people to have more children in that capacity. So it's important to know the importance of the role of women. Women have always worked in the labor force. They have always worked in the labor force. Women have always contributed economically to the family. It's just that they were not paid outside of the home, and therefore what they performed was not considered work. Work by definition is something that you are compensated for. There was a very interesting case, and I believe it was in the country of Australia, where it was a divorce case, and the husband filed for divorce from the wife, and damages were, alimony was determined. And so what the judge did, which was very unique, is that the judge said, what I want you to do, speaking to the wife, I want you to put a dollar amount to everything you performed as a wife over the last 10 years. So if he had to send his clothes to the cleaners, eating out, the cooking she did, hiring a maid to do the cleaning, someone to babysit the kids, all of those things. And the figure she came up with on the average was $60,000 a year. So he had to pay her $600,000 for the 10 years. Women contribute to families and to the economy, and they are not always compensated for it. And it's important for us to understand that as we look at the problem of gender roles and inequality in our society.